Prairie, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm going to try to connect my work over the past few years, especially about how it connects to the Prairie experience living here. Being born in Hungary and not too far from Budapest, it was a very oppressive situation with the communist regime. We had a lot of constraints in our lives. Of course, in 1956, in November, the revolution broke out, and that was quite a turning point for all of us. My father was involved. He would, at night time, come home, lock the door, place his machine gun by the door, and what we were told from an early age on is that turning on the shortwave radio and listening to the Voice of America was the truth from the West, meaning it was the truth of what freedom was all about and our desire to be there and to have that kind of experience. As the revolution wore on, he eventually got pulled in and asked and was interrogated, why did you have a machine gun and so forth. Now, fortunately, it was let go, and our family had to make a decision about the prospects of him being arrested. He had already spent 3 years as a war prisoner in Siberia, so it was a quick decision to move out. Now, the piece that came that's in the show right now is the Voice of America, because it does reference that time where it was the height of the Cold War. So the great superpowers of the time, the Soviets and the USA, of course, were constantly vying for being strategic. Voice of America, the piece that you see in the gallery right now, and to my great delight, really talks about how, or attempts to say how the Voice of America was telling the fighters to keep fighting because you're doing the right thing and kill the communists and so forth. And we're coming, just keep fighting. Of course, they never did come. So in a sense, it's a moment in time that seems to be repeated over and over again. So, and the piece is primarily about that. Once my mother, actually, who was really the source for making the initiative to leave the country, she went out, found out how to do it, hired the guides, organized selling all our goods to pay for the guides, and at long last, in the middle of November, we were able to, with the help of the guides, through a very long, foggy night, through the cold and the muddy fields and forests, we ended up in Australia. Lots of close encounters and so forth. Last year, as a reference to that, I created a piece that speaks about, hopefully, about her initiative, dragging the 3 children, who I was the eldest at 10 years of age. And really, the metal piece is probably my oldest or the most familiar material I've worked with. It goes back to my teenage years, and I've only made about 3 pieces working with the material, and this one was a piece that I actually found that was incomplete. The female figure was something that I could not resolve a number of years ago. I found it last year, and then the idea came to me that, you know, it was time to deal with that moment and honor her. She was only 5 foot tall, perhaps on a good day, and she always wore high heels and her hair high, so I think she'd be proud to have seen that her legs are in this situation exceptionally long. So I think, you know, I hope I did honor to her. Coming to Canada, we landed in Point Douglas and tried to assimilate. Now, the piece that was in the craft show 2 years ago tries to deal with that whole issue about coming to a different place, particularly the prairies, and you know, the whole process. I mean, we're all familiar about leaving a place that we long for and arriving to a new place where you have to deal with the changes. And this particular piece was all about that, trying to show the ambivalence of being in a place with a multi-directional vessel. You don't know if one day your heart is breaking for losing what you had, a life that you had, and the next day you're hoping and you're glad to be here, you're glad to be in freedom, you're glad to, but it's a constant battle, and it takes takes time for it to resolve. So where did I get my steel experience? It started in high school. I had a very eccentric art teacher, Arnold Grutter. He asked me what I did for a summer job. He said, well, I was welding combines to, $1.18 an hour. I said, oh, is that right? Well, why don't you go to the auto shop and why don't you build me something? So I made a 18-inch steel figure, crouched over. Okay, go back. I want you to make it as big as you can. A lot of classes were skipped. I was enjoying myself. And 8 months later, I ended up building a three-figure piece that ended up being in the City Hall. To this day, it's still there. And there's a bit of a detail on the left. And really, my knowledge of the human anatomy was very short, especially on the female side, so things were a little, shall we say, overdone. But that is a material that really surprised me and really engaged me because it is absolutely malleable, and so it's a material that I work with off and on over the years. I think if I had taken clay much earlier, I probably would have been it for the rest of my life, because I discovered this miraculous material that comes from the earth and goes through all these transformations. So I started working with the various pieces. Most of them were hand-built because throwing on a wheel was very difficult. So most of them were. Then eventually I moved into rakuing the pieces, again many hand-built pieces, and I built my own raku kiln. And this is in the 90s, and started doing hand-built pieces, started to incorporate material like steel, wood as well. Some of the pieces, then I experimented with barrel firing and breaking things apart, gluing them back together. That's in the spirit piece. One day I walk into the mostly stone gallery, and I just about passed off. And I said, that's the next step. Porcelain, white, malleable. This piece in Janice Howard's class took me a half a dozen classes. It's the most valuable item I have. It's no more than 4 inches long. I think I paid about 6 courses to get to this point. I then, of course, did some of her kind of work, very minimalistic, beautiful pieces. And of course, as time went on, I was able to push it a little bit more and work with the wheel a bit more. And then I took porcelain pieces and started to use different firing techniques like barrel firing, hand-built pieces. So I said, glass. There is an interesting idea. I started using fusing glasses, pieces. I ended up wondering, okay, what's cast glass doing? Let's do that. So the question was form and function versus concept, and I certainly see this as a very blurry area for in work, in craft. As we live and work with it long enough, we start acquiring those aesthetics, those words, visual words or considerations. So how does the Prairie aesthetics fit into my work? And I think I'm affected by it not only in my aesthetics, but also the way I process my work. Living here is a very interior lifestyle, isn't it? I mean, mostly we're inside, and then really dealing with those elements, I think for me, creates a bond amongst us, because what do we talk about next day is the elements within the prairies. I think it affects my processes because driving down that straight highway in the summertime, and all of a sudden you have a chance to delayer and start reflecting. And those reflections, I think, are my source for ideas about potential projects. I think the Prairie, it really defines us in a very direct way. It certainly does me. Meeting new groups who come to this, new cultural groups who continually come to this place, reminds me of my past. And in fact, this particular piece originally was meant to be going on a grass, but I couldn't figure out how to put a grass base on this thing, so I ended up putting a metal base instead. But the idea was that that's supposed to go to the prairies, to the tall grass, and a very much prairie experience. At least for me, seeing new groups deal with all the things that our family dealt with in arriving here reminded me of my early years, and therefore that particular piece really came out of that stream of consciousness of they have left something behind, and usually it could be quite dramatic, and even deciding to come here is an enormous dramatic and sometimes difficult experience. So this particular piece really comes out of that, being here, being on the highway, having a time to delayer, to reflect, and then using that as a source for ideas, which then allows us to think about our own experience, but of experiences of others as well. So I thank you very much.